Poštovani gledaoci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Pokret BRICS predstavlja značajnu političku i ekonomsku inicijativu koja se pojavila u protekle 2 decenije. Ova grupacija čini 5 zemalja: Brazil, Rusija, Indija, Kina i Južna Afrika. Iako su različite po mnogim aspektima, te zemlje su prepoznale zajedničke interese i potrebu za udruživanjem. Njihov je utjecaj u globalnoj politici sve značajniji, a njihova ekonomska snaga igra ključnu ulogu u globalnim ekonomskim trendovima, trgovini i investicijama. BRICS se ističe kao izraz multipolarnosti u svjetskoj politici, izazivajući tradicionalne sile i pružajući alternativne perspektive i pristupe rješavanju globalnih izazova. Na njihovom nedavnom samitu u Južnoj Africi, grupacija je odlučila da pozove 6 zemalja: Argentinu, Egipat, Iran, Etiopiju, Saudijsku Arabiju i Ujedinjene Arapske Emirate da postanu nove članice bloka. Ali zbog čega bi grupacija, koju predvode Kina i Rusija, bila atraktivna zemljama u razvoju? Više detalja u uvodnom prilogu.
I dok su lideri Brazila, Indije i Kine doputovali u Južnu Afriku na 15. samit zemalja BRICS-a, ruski predsjednik je učestvovao virtualno. Posljedica je to naloga za hapšenjem kojeg je raspisao Međunarodni sud pravde, a vezano za navodne ratne zločine u Ukrajini. Umjesto Putina u Johannesburg je doputovao ministar vanjskih poslova Sergej Lavrov. Jedan od visoko postavljenih ciljeva ovogodišnje agende bio je širenje bloka. Najmanje 23 zemlje, među kojima su Iran i Argentina, su formalno aplicirale za pristupanje BRICS-u. I dok velike ekonomije poput Kine i Rusije podržavaju takav potez, konsenzus ipak ne postoji.
Mislim da je problem sami prihodi članica BRICS-a. Južna Afrika, kao najmanja ekonomija u ovoj grupi, često je predmet kritika. Njeno primanje u organizaciju BRICS-a 2008. godine je u najvećoj mjeri napravljeno na insistiranje Kine, a ne konsenzusom svih članica. Zbog toga mislim da je Indija bila malo dvosmislena, ali generalno postoji konsenzus da je došlo vrijeme za proširenje bloka.
Zemlje članice predstavljaju blizu 40% svjetske populacije, a gledane kao jedna cjelina čine trećinu svjetske ekonomije. Tema samita bila je BRICS i Afrika, što jasno naglašava želju bloka da širi svoj utjecaj na kontinentu koji sve više postaje globalna pozornica za nadmetanje svjetskih sila. Također, to je prilika da se BRICS predstavi kao alternativni razvojni partner zapadnim ekonomijama. Blok želi bolje zastupati ekonomije u razvoju kroz povećanje razvoja infrastrukture i industrije u Africi, što bi u konačnici povećalo trgovinu i investicije.
Kroz članstvo u BRICS-u u stalnom smo kontaktu sa ekonomijama koje će biti nosioci svjetskog ekonomskog razvoja. To nam olakšava put kako bi naši proizvodi stigli do tih tržišta. Zato nam je ovo članstvo veoma bitno. Također, kroz blok možemo promovisati afričke proizvode, usluge, trgovačke prakse, sve kako bi imali lakši pristup tim tržištima.
Jedna od značajnijih tema na ovogodišnjem samitu bio je američki dolar, odnosno kako smanjiti zavisnost zemalja članica o ovoj valuti. Prijedlog predsjednika Brazila bio je da BRICS napravi svoju valutu koja bi se koristila u trgovini i investicijama među zemljama članicama. Međutim, ekonomski eksperti vjeruju da bi to bio veoma kompliciran zadatak, uzimajući u obzir ekonomske, političke i geografske razlike među zemljama koje čine ovaj blok.
Idemo sada slikom do Washingtona gdje se nalazi Carlos Roa, glavni i odgovorni urednik magazina The National Interest. Carlos, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, predictions about BRICS countries as the fastest growing economies haven't quite panned out. Instead, the alliance now is offering a diplomatic forum and development financing outside of the Western mainstream. Can BRICS nations offer an alternative to the West, perhaps a new world order? Or is this too far-fetched?
Well, keep in mind the BRICS group started, well, really people kind of forget this, but the concept started out proposed by Goldman Sachs economists just to describe growing economies which investors could invest in. It wasn't ever really conceived originally as a political grouping. Instead, like 2 years, 1 year after the Goldman Sachs economist proposed the term, leaders of those countries said, hey, let's start an international summit around this concept and just see where it goes. Mm-hmm. So even to this day, they haven't hashed out a coherent political agenda other than a general, we think there should be a more equitable distribution of power and resources from the global north, the G7, to the global south.
Right. So are you saying that these BRICS countries disagree on more issues than they agree on?
The one thing they agree on generally is the belief that there should be, once again, distribution of resources, more national development, more investment in the global south. But otherwise, they disagree on pretty much almost everything else.
Right. So that's the reason why they haven't been able to come up with a common agenda. So what do you think are the top factors now driving interest in BRICS, especially across the global south? And what effects could this expansion have on the global economic order over time? I mean, you saw in the last summit in South Africa, 6 new countries being invited to join the organization.
Well, I would say there are 3 factors, that are driving this interest. First of all, it's the general sense the United States is declining relatively in terms of its power. So cues, about where to go, what direction the world should take from Washington aren't being heard as well. The second is, it's pretty apparent at this point, the Washington consensus, the Western economic model of free trade, is not exactly delivering on any development goals or agenda. And if anything, as we can see in the West, it's leading to populist anger, job calls for let's bring back jobs back home, so on and so forth. So with people checking out of the Western economic model, they're looking forward to what I think is the third factor, China, because China's economic model of investment heavily in infrastructure, building, and so forth has, for all its critiques, delivered amazing growth. China went from being a poor country to a very rich, or at least moderately rich, very well-developed country in a few decades. So people are taking their cues from that.
Now, Carlos, how do you make sense of the fact that traditional U.S. allies from the Gulf, such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are now showing interest and being officially invited to join BRICS?
Without being a Saudi Arabia or UAE official, my view is that they are hedging. They want to keep the U.S. as a valued ally. Saudi Arabia kind of stresses this, the UAE to extent. At the same time, they read the tea leaves and figure, well, just in case if something happens to the United States, whether it be unstable domestic politics via Donald Trump or some populist election or an economic crisis, and something happens, we want to have backup options or another ability. So this is why we have the Saudis happy to go along with mediation by China with Iran, or trying to seek in Saudi Arabia's case, nuclear development, nuclear power plants, which some people opine could later expand to nuclear program to defend themselves in case the Iranians get the bomb, and so forth. But the general view is it's a hedge. It's saying, well, in case the U.S. has a bad day and the G7 goes with it, we have a backup option.
Right. So now, in terms of disagreements within BRICS, could you touch on the tensions between India and China? I mean, more broadly, is there an inherent contradiction between more authoritarian states such as Russia and China and the more sort of democratically oriented ones such as India, South Africa, and to a certain extent Brazil?
There is, and I think we can see this with the latest BRICS summit last week, which was the intention is between those countries, most of them who say, we just want BRICS to be a platform and a forum for international development, driving more investment, sharing resources, etc. And China, which is quietly trying to push it to be a geopolitical force to challenge or at least contest the Western-led order. By this, it says, well, we want which would be more seats in the UN Security Council, greater say international fora, and so forth. Right now, it seems that the strength is slowly on China's side, given recent additions, the group members, but these are still inherent contradictions that have yet to be resolved. So if hypothetically the United States suffers severe loss in power in the next few years, then the question would come up, okay, there's now more, let's call it equal distribution of power. What's the agenda now? And that is the tension. That's where people are unsure what to say.
Right. Finally,
but just want to briefly touch on this. There's also a sense of, well, what's the economic model? Yes, the American-led free trade order isn't doing well, but China now is undergoing economic slowdown, and not every country can copy its model. So what is the next model for economic development in the global south? And no one seems to have a solid answer to that yet.
Right, Carlos, I'm afraid we'll have to end it here. Carlos Roa, it's a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
BRICS zemlje predstavljaju značajan dio globalne ekonomije i imaju ključnu ulogu u oblikovanju svjetskih ekonomskih tokova. Evo statističke analize njihove ekonomske moći. Naš drugi gost se također uključuje iz Washingtona. Pozdravljam Tom O'Connora, urednika za vanjsku politiku magazina Newsweek. Tom, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, let me start by asking you, can you explain to our viewers the key economic and geopolitical advantages that make BRICS an attractive alliance for developing nations seeking to enhance their global influence and their economic growth?
Absolutely. Well, at a minimum, what BRICS has done is provide a forum for a number of countries with various geopolitical aims, which of course are diverse among member states, both current and aspiring, to discuss matters of economic trade, financing, development in a forum that isn't governed or led by Western powers. And what this does is open up a number of opportunities for both the reformation of existing systems as well as establishing alternative mechanisms to the current regimes out there that truly dominate financing options for the countries of the global south, for example, as well as threaten trade sometimes between countries that may be subject to U.S. sanctions. So this, I would say, is the major advantages that a growing number of countries, frankly, see in getting involved in BRICS. Now, I still think that at this time, even the BRICS countries themselves would say that the potential currently still outweighs the actual action here, but there are actual steps being taken toward, for example, conducting trade in national currencies, working through the new development bank, of course, as an alternative to the systems that traditionally dominate this field, such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank.
The World Bank, yeah. I mean, but they've talked about creating their own currency. Do you think this is still a far-fetched idea for BRICS?
Well, I think that, there was a lot of talk going into this last summit about this, and we didn't see specifically on the intra-BRICS currency a lot of progress here. But we have, again, seen increasing trade done between countries, whether it's India and Russia, for example, Brazil and China, trade conducted in these national currencies. So I think that the idea of de-dollarization is still something that we've seen gaining traction, really, among large parts of the world. And it's the sort of thing where I believe it was Ben Steele on the Council of Foreign Relations who said this quite some time ago to me. He likened the idea of U.S. sanctions to the use of antibiotics to treat diseases. It could be a very powerful weapon, but over time it loses its effectiveness. And what we're seeing, I think, is some of the effects of that. This perceived weaponization of the U.S. dollar is something that I think is certainly affecting some of these sentiments that are emerging from these various countries.
Right. Now, Tom, what factors have contributed to the growing importance of the BRICS organization on the global stage, and how does its emergence challenge the traditional dominance of the Western powers?
Now, there's this misconception, I think, that exists about BRICS for people who maybe are just more recently following the rise of this group, that it always existed to challenge, the Western-led paradigm on international financial trade and development options. But really, BRICS started as a sort of informal gathering of emerging economies that looked to reform the existing system, especially after the financial crisis. And that, of course, began with Brazil, Russia, India, China. South Africa later joined, and it was a perceived lack of action and lack of satisfactory reform within these systems that really drove the more geopolitical nature of this group, which of course has become very prominent, I think, in recent years. And this also manifested in the new development bank establishments around 2014. So what we've seen right now is this actual effort to challenge, I think, that existing paradigm. And, to give some examples of how this could eventually prove extremely consequential in geopolitics. We've seen two of the aspiring members right now, Iran and Saudi Arabia, to join. To have a system where Iran and Saudi Arabia, two major energy countries, would be able to export to major consumers such as China and India in a system that's free of sanctions, an environment that's immune to the U.S. being able to implement those coercive economic measures to try to punish a country in the event of a conflict, really now immunizes that trade. It creates more resilient networks that builds confidence among the actual member states, regardless of their geopolitical backings, because, of course, we've seen how U.S. sanctions can be used, even sometimes against countries that are considered traditional partners. It's building this confidence among these countries that they can continue to conduct and expand those trade options, regardless of perhaps the U.S. foreign policy decisions.
Right. Now, Tom, in what ways does BRICS promote cooperation and collaboration among its member states? And how does this cooperation benefit the developing world, in areas like technology and infrastructure and trade?
Yeah, and I think this goes back, especially if we talk about the global south, the developing world, we have to really take a spotlight on the actual lack of options that exist for many of these countries, the high interest rates for borrowing from Western-backed lenders. This is something that has really proven an obstacle for development, actually. We see in many countries, whether it's Pakistan right now and their current struggles with the IMF, or across Africa, of course, which is a very potent example, and I think speaks a lot to the emerging trends right now. We're seeing countries in Africa, countries in Asia, countries in Latin America looking to say that we need to reform this current system. So that with these new options, these alternative options, comes a range of different opportunities to cooperate in technology, in development, in various fields that previously would be perhaps very difficult to achieve because of the constraints that exist among these countries and because of these current options. So I think that there's certainly a variety of opportunities here. Again, I think that there's potential here, perhaps more so in many ways than there's actually been action, but it's changing. And I think that if you look at BRICS, outside of of just the annual summits. And you see the BRICS youth organizations, the various BRICS initiatives that exist among these countries. They're very active, and they are talking about ways to expand this cooperation beyond just perhaps national trade or intra-BRICS currency stuff, but actually into these other areas such as tech, such as health, such as science, and various ways to help these countries support each other in innovating.
Now, what are the key areas where BRICS can, where BRICS member countries, particularly Russia and China, are cooperating to counterbalance U.S. influence, and how does this cooperation between them impact global geopolitics and economics?
Well, certainly another thing I think is important to highlight is that among the individual BRICS members, and also, of course, the aspiring members, there is a diversity of motivations here when it comes to how they're approaching this emerging order right now. Of course, some countries such as China and Russia are much more explicit about wanting to challenge what they see as an unfair and sometimes even menacing Western-led order, particularly that involves really more see this as a potential way to amplify the voices of the global South and pursue what's sometimes been termed by some experts to be a strategy of active non-alignment, whereby they're not aligning themselves with the Chinas or the Russias of the world, but they're also not aligning themselves with the United States. And increasingly, that seems to be manifesting itself in more frustration with the Western and U.S. side of the equation. And then, of course, there's India, which has been pursuing greater cooperation with the United States, but at the same time wants to maintain that strategic autonomy and very much, given its own rise as a power, given its own potential and its growing economy and growing population, it wants to make sure it has that say and secures that say in what many people are terming to be an increasingly multipolar world order. India wants to be a major power in that, and it does not see itself being able to do that, or it would be much more difficult to do that if it wasn't part of these forums such as BRICS, or even to some extent the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which we can't forget either.
Right. But Tom, how do you make sense of the fact that traditional U.S. allies in the Gulf, such as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, are now showing interest and they have officially been invited to join BRICS?
Yeah, in some ways, you'd think years ago this would seem like unthinkable almost.
Exactly.
And frankly, if Saudi Arabia were to join alongside Iran into an organization like BRICS or the SCO, it would be seen as a positive thing for the United States, because the U.S. would see itself as being able to secure influence within these organizations. But the world has changed, and we've seen the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia specifically come to some very difficult times right now, and that's because that exclusive relationship that the United States had enjoyed with Saudi Arabia, and to some extent the UAE as well, of course, is shifting. And Saudi Arabia sees itself also as an emerging middle power in international affairs. It wants to diversify its foreign relations, and that goes into economics, that goes into security, goes into trade, it goes into various fields with the other major powers of the world. And that includes both China and Russia, but also other countries as far away as Korea, for example. South Korea is another power that, of course, that Saudi Arabia sees itself getting closer with. And so this is right now, I think, a product of that, and also a sign of what's to come right now. And I think that the U.S. has been somewhat perhaps slow to realize that. It's been perhaps somewhat dismissive of this. There hasn't been a coherent policy towards BRICS, for example, really from the United States. And that's because it is a very complex and challenging order, and it doesn't necessarily warrant a policy that's necessarily always hostile, I think, or antagonistic against BRICS. There has to be a mix there of engagement. There has to be a mix there of providing alternatives. But it's proven a major foreign policy challenge, one I think that's only to grow in time.
Right. Tom, it's such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you.
Uprkos svom utjecaju, BRICS se suočava sa izazovima u postizanju konsenzusa unutar grupacije s obzirom na različite interese i dinamiku između članica. Također, kritičari tvrde da BRICS može funkcionisati kao blok samo u određenim pitanjima, dok su u drugim i dalje konkurirajuće sile. Poštovani gledaoci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.